can you always trust what you remember, especially about, say, political events? What if someone was trying to reshape how you remember even recent history?
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, today we're going to explore that how established facts, particularly around the Republican Party in recent years, seem to have been, well, strategically revised. Our main source here is Steve Benen's book, Ministry of Truth.
And it really digs into this phenomenon.
Absolutely. And as we get into this, it might be helpful to think about resources like Mindful Moments. It's a YouTube channel using AI for book analysis, sort of helps you reflect, think critically about the info you consume.
That critical thinking aspect is key here, isn't it? Because what Benen highlights is this deliberate effort to condition people to distrust independent information.
Making them more receptive to alternative narratives.
Exactly. Narratives often amplified by partisan media outlets. It's about creating a sort of separate information ecosystem.
Okay, let's start with an example. Trump's farewell address, January 19th, 2021. The context was, well, pretty dramatic.
Extremely dramatic. Yeah, the second impeachment just days before. Bipartisan support for it.
Right, abuse of power, obstruction of Congress.
And then just a week before that, the January 6th Capitol insurrection. There are even talks about invoking the 25th Amendment.
So a really intense moment. And then comes the farewell address.
And the address itself presented this strikingly different picture of his presidency, almost completely detached from those immediate circumstances.
Yeah, he called for Americans to rise above partisan rancor, which, felt a bit jarring given his role in, well, fueling that rancor.
It did, but more than that, the substance of the speech, his recounting of his record, was just plainly at odds with what had actually happened over the previous 4 years.
So was this just spin or something more calculated?
Well, Benen argues it's more than just spin. It's about actively reframing reality, setting up a specific narrative for supporters moving forward.
Okay, let's shift gears. The IRS scandal. You probably remember that one, accusations that the IRS was targeting conservative groups.
Oh yeah, that got a lot of airtime. Huge political controversy.
But what actually happened when people looked into it?
That's the crucial part. There were multiple investigations. The IRS's own internal review.
Okay.
Congressional Republicans spent 2 years investigating. The FBI looked into it. A federal prosecutor was assigned. The Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, the IRS watchdog, did a deep dive.
So a lot of scrutiny.
A lot. And every single one came back with the same conclusion. No evidence of systemic political targeting. No White House involvement.
So what did they find?
They found that groups across the political spectrum, liberal, conservative, non-ideological, faced similar levels of scrutiny based on keywords in their applications, not their politics. It was bureaucratic, not political.
But the narrative persisted.
Absolutely. Despite being thoroughly debunked, the GOP used the scandal narrative for years. For fundraising, political leverage.
Right, like against Biden's infrastructure plan, arguing against more funding for IRS enforcement.
Exactly. And you even had the Wall Street Journal editorial board continuing to insist on unfair targeting, long after the evidence showed otherwise. House Speaker McCarthy was still repeating the debunked claims years later.
It became a kind of touchstone then.
Very much so. Benen argues it serves the purpose of demonizing the IRS, which fits the narrative of an anti-tax party. It shows how a myth, once established, can be incredibly hard to dislodge, even with overwhelming facts against it.
Let's talk about Charlottesville. August 2017, the white nationalist rally, the violence, the murder of Heather Heyer. A really ugly moment.
Truly disturbing. And Trump's initial response condemned hatred on many sides.
Which itself drew criticism.
Right. But then, a few days later, he doubled down, saying there were very fine people on both sides. He specifically mentioned people protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue.
But who are those people protesting alongside?
That's the point. They included the neo-Nazis and white supremacists chanting vile racist and anti-Semitic slogans. They weren't separate groups. They were part of the same protest.
So why backtrack and defend them?
Benen points to the intense backlash Trump received. Allies started abandoning him. Businesses pulled events from Mar-a-Lago. It seems his attempt to rewrite what he said was driven by trying to repair the damage, especially with his base. It fits a pattern.
Okay, another example. The 1776 Commission. This was set up right before the 2020 election.
Yeah, the stated goal was to, quote, clear away the twisted web of lies being taught in schools about American history.
But the commission itself was controversial, wasn't it?
Highly. It pointedly lacked actual professional historians. And the report they released on Trump's very last full day in office promoted a very specific far-right view of history, essentially blaming modern ills on the left.
And we saw echoes of this elsewhere, like Florida.
Exactly. Think about the controversy over the Florida African-American history standards, particularly the part suggesting enslaved people developed skills that could be used for their personal benefit. Huge outcry. Accusations of partisan influence rewriting history.
So Benen connects these dots.
He sees it as part of a broader strategy. The expectation seems to be, if you repeat a certain version of history often enough, people will just believe it. Trump even posted on social media once, with time, people forget.
Which brings us to the whole Russia hoax narrative.
Right. You had prominent figures like Elise Stefanik, Mike Pence, repeatedly calling investigations into Russian interference, or even later scandals, the Russia hoax 2.0, tying it all together as some kind of illicit plot against Trump.
But let's ground this in the facts of the 2016 interference. What did happen?
Well, the core facts are well established. Russian intelligence hacked the Democratic National Committee and figures like John Podesta. They stole materials.
And then released them strategically.
Yes, through outlets like WikiLeaks, specifically to damage Hillary Clinton's campaign and help Donald Trump's. It was an unprecedented attack by a foreign adversary on a U.S. election.
And U.S. intelligence agencies were clear about this. They told Trump.
Absolutely. They briefed him directly that Russia was responsible. But Trump publicly and repeatedly sided with the Kremlin's denials. He even famously called on Russia during the campaign to find Clinton's missing emails.
Which then led to concerns about coordination.
Precisely. Suspicions arose about potential links, even cooperation, between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives. That's what triggered the FBI's counterintelligence investigation, Crossfire Hurricane.
And what did subsequent investigations like the Senate Intelligence Committees find?
Their bipartisan report, a massive piece of work, confirmed Russia's sweeping attack. And crucially, it found the Trump campaign was aware of Russia's efforts, welcomed the help, and expected to benefit from it. It detailed numerous contacts, including campaign chairman Paul Manafort sharing internal polling data with a Russian intelligence officer.
Yet some Republicans pushed back hard.
Very hard. House Judiciary Committee Republicans released videos claiming Democratic statements about Russian interference were lies, even though those statements were factually accurate based on the intelligence assessments and the Senate report.
And then came the Durham report.
Right. John Durham was appointed by Attorney General Barr to investigate the origins of the Russia probe. His report criticized the FBI's handling of the investigation, but it didn't actually uncover the grand conspiracy Republicans had hoped for. It didn't fundamentally discredit the finding that Russia did interfere.
But how was it framed by Republicans?
They immediately declared victory. They claimed it proved the whole thing was a hoax, a politically motivated hit job from the start. It showed a complete disconnect from the actual findings of the report, let alone the underlying facts of Russian interference.
The New York Times even observed the American right seemed to be living in its own universe.
It's a stark contrast. Think back historically, Adlai Stevenson, Hubert Humphrey, both were approached by Soviets offering campaign help. They both refused and immediately reported it to U.S. authorities.
A very different standard of conduct.
Worlds apart. It highlights a significant shift.
Okay, let's move to the big lie about the 2020 election. The claim that it was stolen through widespread fraud.
This is perhaps the most consequential example. The Trump campaign itself spent a lot of money trying to find evidence of fraud. Over $500,000 with one firm, Berkeley Research Group.
Right.
Another $750,000 with Simpatico software systems. They were hired specifically to find proof.
And did they?
No. Both firms reported back that they can find no evidence to support the claims of widespread fraud that would have changed the outcome.
Was Trump told this?
Repeatedly. By his campaign manager, Bill Stepien, by his own lawyers, by data experts, by top officials at the Justice Department, including Attorney General Bill Barr, by Homeland Security officials responsible for election security. They all told him he had lost, and his fraud claims were bogus.
Barr's testimony was quite blunt, wasn't it?
Extremely. He said there was never an indication of interest from Trump in what the actual facts were. He called the claims bullshit.
Yet the claims persisted. Mail-in voting fraud, for example.
Yes, despite election officials and experts, including Trump's own Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, explaining why those fears were unfounded. Barr himself floated some wild hypotheticals early on, but later admitted there was no evidence.
And there were reports Trump planned to declare victory regardless.
Yes, reports emerged he planned to declare victory prematurely on election night, regardless of the vote count. And indeed, in the early hours of November 4th, he went out and falsely claimed he'd already won and the election was being stolen.
And how did other GOP leaders react?
Initially, many prominent figures, like Kevin McCarthy and Lindsey Graham, publicly backed Trump's claims. Graham even reportedly pressured Georgia's Secretary of State about invalidating legally cast ballots.
Senator Chris Murphy called it an epidemic of delusion.
It seemed that way.
Yeah.
The New York Times pointed out the oddity. Republicans were celebrating their own victories down the ballot in the very same election, where they claimed the presidential result was fraudulent.
We also had that infamous press conference with Rudy Giuliani.
Oh, yes. Baseless conspiracy theories, hair dye running down his face. It was quite a spectacle, pushing completely unfounded claims.
Trump kept saying he had so much evidence.
But none ever materialized. No credible proof was ever presented in court or anywhere else. The evidence that was sometimes released was just a rehash of absurdities already debunked.
What about things like the 2000 Mules documentary?
That film claimed to have a smoking gun using cell phone geolocation data to track supposed ballot mules. But independent analyses widely panned it. Fact-checkers called it misleading, flawed, a big lie in a new package. Even Bill Barr, when shown the premise, reportedly burst out laughing. It created this dangerous feedback loop, didn't it?
Exactly. Benen describes it well. GOP officials lie about the election, their base comes to believe the lies, and then the politicians point to public opinion polls showing belief in the lies as proof that their original lies were true.
It's a self-reinforcing cycle.
And the implication for democracy is chilling. If election results are only deemed legitimate when your side wins, where does that leave us?
It fundamentally undermines the entire system, which is why understanding these narratives, like we try to do with resources like Mindful Moments and in these discussions, is so important.
Let's talk about January 6th itself. The attack on the Capitol. The images are unforgettable.
Visceral, powerful, hard to misinterpret what you were seeing live on television.
But the narrative around it started shifting almost immediately within parts of the GOP.
It did. The very first, very brief narrative was that it wasn't Trump supporters at all, but far-left Antifa provocateurs disguised as them.
That didn't last long, did it?
No, it fell apart quickly under the weight of evidence, the arrests, the videos, the social media posts of the actual participants. So the narrative shifted.
Shifted to what?
To portraying the rioters not as violent insurrectionists, but as conservative patriots. People who were being unfairly persecuted simply for having concerns about election integrity.
How did Trump's own statements change?
Initially, his written statements condemned the violence and those who broke the law. But very quickly, his rhetoric changed dramatically. He started claiming the election was the real insurrection. He called the January 6th criminals patriots. He said the riot represented the greatest movement in history. He even floated pardons and apologies for them.
Senator Ron Johnson also had evolving views, didn't he?
Yes, initially he suggested fake Trump protesters might be involved. Later, he was claiming the rioters were people who truly respect law enforcement and loved this country despite the violent clashes with police.
It's quite a rewrite.
Former Defense Secretary William Cohen said those trying to downplay January 6 were attempting a frontal lobotomy on the American people, trying to make us forget what we all saw.
And other counter-narratives popped up too.
Oh, yes. Blaming Mike Pence for not overturning the election, blaming Nancy Pelosi for security failures, suggesting rogue FBI informants instigated the whole thing. Lots of contradictory narratives, all aimed at deflecting blame from Trump and his supporters.
George Will compared the potential impact of January 6th to 9/11, a real shock to the system.
And he argued the GOP seemed determined to prevent that kind of clear understanding from taking hold. Benen talks about a far-right ecosystem of true believers embracing this through-the-looking-glass narrative.
And Trump amplified it.
Constantly. His focus on Ashley Babbitt, who was shot while trying to breach the speaker's lobby, became a central part of this martyr narrative.
And later, Trump and even Mike Pompeo claimed there had been a peaceful transition of power.
Which is just astounding, given the violence of January 6th aimed specifically at stopping that transition.
Then there was Kevin McCarthy giving Tucker Carlson exclusive access to tens of thousands of hours of Capitol security footage.
Right, which raised huge security concerns and allowed Carlson to cherry-pick clips to create a misleading narrative minimizing the violence. And you have Lee Stefanik pushing to formally expunge Trump's impeachment related to January 6th.
What does polling show about Republican views now?
It's quite striking. Polls show significant percentages of Republicans don't believe the Capitol assault was an attack on government or an attempt to overturn the election. A majority agreed with the RNC resolution calling the events legitimate political discourse, and most believe Trump bears little or no responsibility.
So the counter-narrative has been effective within that base.
It appears so. But it's crucial, Benen emphasizes, to remember what January 6th actually was: a violent attack on the seat of American democracy fueled by lies about the election.
Let's pivot to the Ukraine scandal. Trump's first impeachment, what was the core issue there?
Simply put, Trump withheld congressionally approved military aid to Ukraine while pressuring Ukraine's president, Zelensky, to announce investigations that would politically benefit Trump, specifically investigations into Joe Biden and his son, Hunter.
The Washington Post editorial board put it bluntly: Trump tried to force Ukraine to meddle in the 2020 election.
Yes. The whole thing came to light largely because of a whistleblower complaint and the release of notes from that July 2019 phone call between Trump and Zelensky.
And there was a clear quid pro quo.
The evidence strongly suggested it. The military aid was frozen. Key figures testified that the message conveyed to Ukraine was, if you want the aid unlocked and a White House meeting, you need to announce these investigations. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who was on the call, testified it was an improper demand that undermined U.S. national security.
Ambassador Gordon Sondland confirmed delivering that message, didn't he?
He did. He testified there was a quid pro quo regarding the White House meeting, directly ordered by Trump via Giuliani. The link to the military aid was also heavily implied.
The White House released a summary transcript of the call,
Which, ironically, actually seemed to support the allegations rather than refute them. It showed Trump asking Zelensky for a favor right after Zelensky mentioned military aid.
Trump reacted angrily during the impeachment inquiry.
He sent this wild 6-page letter to Congress filled with rage and deflection. He was widely described as unhinged.
The House impeached him. Abuse of power, obstruction of Congress.
Yes, with 0 Republican votes in favor. And importantly, the Government Accountability Office, a nonpartisan watchdog, later concluded the hold on the aid was not just improper, it was illegal.
But the Senate trial ended differently.
It did. Most Republican senators seemed to ignore the arguments and evidence presented. Trump was acquitted, with Mitt Romney the only Republican breaking ranks to vote guilty on the abuse of power charge.
What was the GOP's rhetorical strategy?
Largely, it was to claim Democrats hadn't proven their case, that it was all just a partisan exercise, ignoring the substance of the evidence. You had Republicans like Debbie Lesko outright denying Trump had even asked Ukraine to investigate Biden, which was demonstrably false based on the call transcript itself. Mike Braun said similar things.
And did the scandal just fade away?
To some extent. The end of the trial, then the immediate onset of the COVID-19 pandemic sort of pushed it out of the headlines. But the effort to downplay it continued.
How so?
You still hear figures like Ted Cruz or Ron DeSantis calling the impeachment bogus based merely on a phone call, completely ignoring the context of the withheld aid and the pressure campaign. And Trump himself keeps calling for the impeachment to be expunged, effectively erased from history.
Okay, one more quick one. The border wall.
Ah, yes, the big, beautiful wall. Trump's signature campaign promise from 2016.
And the promise wasn't just to build it.
Crucially, it was that Mexico would pay for it. That was repeated constantly.
How did that turn out?
Well, as critics like Chris Christie pointed out later, Mexico obviously didn't pay a peso. And very little new wall was actually built. Estimates are around 47 miles of new primary barrier where none existed before. Most of the work was replacing existing older barriers. And U.S. taxpayers footed the bill.
Despite Trump claiming he built almost 500 miles.
Yes, highly exaggerated claims. And the schemes for how Mexico would pay kept shifting: a one-time payment, revenue from the renegotiated trunk deal, USMCA, somehow flowing back. None of it made sense or happened.
He even made that odd claim about San Antonio having a wall.
Right. Claiming a wall drastically reduced crime in San Antonio, which is, over 100 miles from the border and doesn't have such a wall.
Right.
And later he floated the idea of border tolls to make Mexico pay. It just never matched reality.
Another promise versus reality gap. Let's move to COVID-19, a huge event during his presidency. How did the narrative shaping play out there?
From the very beginning, Trump repeatedly downplayed the virus's severity, comparing it to the common flu, even after he knew, as he admitted to Bob Woodward, that it was far more deadly.
He admitted playing it down intentionally.
Yes, he told Woodward he didn't want to create panic. But Benen argues the administration's actions, or lack thereof, were also a major problem. Failure to prepare adequately, bureaucratic mistakes with testing early on.
Didn't he dismantle the NSC Pandemic Office?
His administration did reorganize it, effectively downgrading pandemic preparedness within the NSC structure, which critics said left the U.S. less prepared. The focus often seemed more on public relations than public health.
Those daily press briefings
became infamous for Trump's rambling, self-serving commentary, often contradicting his own health expert standing beside him. There's evidence the White House overruled public health guidance, pressured the FDA on treatments.
Like hydroxychloroquine.
Exactly. Trump relentlessly promoted it as a game changer, despite lack of evidence, putting pressure on officials. He also repeatedly framed COVID testing negatively, saying it made the U.S. look bad, and arguing illogically that less testing would mean fewer cases.
He also tried to blame the Obama administration.
Yes, falsely claiming the cupboards were bare regarding pandemic preparedness, ignoring the fact that Obama had established the Directorate for Global Health Security specifically for this purpose.
Despite all this, some praised his handling.
Senator Tim Scott, for instance, praised the genius of the Trump administration on COVID. Trump himself falsely claimed the virus was virtually gone when he left office.
And his stance on vaccines evolved, too.
Initially, he took credit for Operation Warp Speed. But later, facing some pushback from his base, he started criticizing booster shots as a money-making operation for Pfizer and suggesting the initial shots were good for life, contrary to scientific guidance.
We also saw figures like Senator Ron Johnson pushing conspiracies.
Yes, Johnson suggested the pandemic was pre-planned and promoted ineffective treatments like ivermectin, even getting suspended from YouTube for misinformation.
What did polling show about public trust?
A Quinnipiac poll found a majority of Republicans trusted Trump more than CDC scientists for COVID information. Benen argues the GOP was remarkably successful in convincing its base that Trump's manifest failures during the pandemic were actually triumphs.
Let's touch on the economy, another area with strong narrative claims.
The constant refrain was that Trump created the greatest economy in history. The reality is more complex. The economy was stable pre-pandemic, continuing trends from the Obama years. But GDP growth was modest, never hitting the 4.6% Trump promised. Growth under Clinton and Reagan was significantly stronger. Job growth actually slowed slightly in Trump's first year compared to Obama's last.
And Trump's own business record wasn't stellar.
No, the New York Times reporting on his tax records showed massive losses over many years, including years where he paid zero federal income tax. And Trump University was exposed as a fraudulent operation.
So where did the greatest ever claim come from?
It seemed to be based on sheer repetition. He claimed it constantly. Lindsey Graham made hyperbolic statements about how the media would cover it if Obama had similar numbers. Trump claimed he reversed failed economic policies. He directly lied to Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, insisting it was the greatest economy ever.
He repeated it in his farewell address, too.
Yes, claimed the greatest economy in the history of the world. And he kept repeating it during his political comeback bid, echoed by allies like Speaker Mike Johnson.
What were his actual economic policies?
Mostly traditional Republican policies, deregulation, and most significantly, large tax cuts heavily favoring corporations and the wealthy, which added trillions to the national debt.
Yet the narrative seems to stick with GOP voters.
Polling often shows Trump with an advantage on the economy, even over Biden, despite the factual record. It illustrates the power of a simple, repeated message within his base. And Republicans are already planning more corporate tax cuts if they regain power.
So looking at all these examples together, what's the bigger picture Benen presents?
He calls it the creation of an artificial version of history. He uses the analogy of Mark Burnett supposedly editing The Apprentice to make Trump look like a brilliant businessman seeing reality as just a first draft to be rewritten.
Like the Lafayette Square incident, the photo op at St. John's Church.
Exactly. Peaceful protesters were forcibly cleared, and the White House immediately started spinning multiple, often contradictory false narratives. They were just enforcing curfew, it wasn't a photo op. Security forces acted in self-defense, comparing Trump inspecting the church to Churchill inspecting bomb damage.
Absurd comparisons.
Completely. The reaction was overwhelmingly negative, even from military leaders. But just 48 hours later, Trump insisted it was handled very well. That quick pivot showed an intent to control the narrative, regardless of what people saw with their own eyes.
Even though the electorate rejected him in 2020.
He and his allies continued trying to rewrite the story of that election and the 2022 midterms as well. You see figures like DeSantis complaining Trump didn't follow through on lock her up, against Hillary Clinton clinging to a desired narrative even when it clashes with reality.
And Trump framing his own indictments
as just a preview of what he'll do to his political foes if reelected, which aligns with what former Chief of Staff John Kelly confirmed. Trump regularly wanted to use the Justice Department against critics.
Ben explicitly references Orwell's 1984.
Yes, the Ministry of Truth. The party telling people to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It's a chilling parallel. Andrew Gawthorpe warned that a party refusing to accept facts signals it might do almost anything for power.
And we see related actions.
Skepticism of unfavorable election results, erecting new voting barriers, degrading institutions like a free press and the rule of law, it all fits into this broader pattern, Benen argues.
So wrapping this up, what's the main takeaway from all these examples?
It's the sheer number and consistency of the efforts. It demonstrates a concerted strategy to reshape how people understand recent history, often flying directly in the face of well-established facts and evidence, all seemingly for political advantage.
Which brings us back to that need for critical thinking you mentioned at the start.
Absolutely. When you encounter information, especially political narratives, it's just so important to question it, to look for multiple perspectives, to check against reliable sources.
Like the approach encouraged by resources such as mindful moments.
Exactly. Developing those habits of mind is crucial in today's information environment.
Well, we hope this discussion has given you some food for thought. We encourage you to subscribe to this program for more conversations like this. Maybe share it with others who might find it interesting.
And if you want to dive deeper into these specific examples, consider checking out Steve Benen's Ministry of Truth. We'll put a link in the show notes.
But most importantly, keep questioning, keep thinking critically about the narratives you encounter every day, and maybe ponder this. What happens to a society long-term when our shared understanding of even the recent past becomes so fractured, so easily manipulated?
A crucial question indeed.